Before we start, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place and elders both past and present. I also recognise those whose ongoing effort to protect and promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island cultures will leave a lasting legacy for future elders and leaders. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Deputy Consul General Tanabe and Mr. Andrew Carter from the Consulate General of Japan in Brisbane today. I can also see Margaret from the Australian Japan Society, so lovely to have you, Margaret. Thank you for coming along. And of course, Mr. John Lamb, our speaker for today, a long-term friend of QSA. He's done a lot of work here. He's researched many, many hours here, and our archivists know him very well. So it's great to have people using their work and telling us about it and letting us be a venue for them to spruik their wares and the results of their research. So today's talk, John will be presenting an overview of his book, Okinawans Reaching Australia, which is the story of all known Okinawans to have reached Australia over the first 6 decades of the 20th century. Throughout John's research, QSA Records played a role in piecing the elements together, and today John will be sharing experiences of his journey and revealing discoveries and connections of this fascinating part of our history. Thank you, John.
Thanks very much. I too acknowledge the local Indigenous elders past, present and emerging. This presentation is a mixture of both the history told in this book and of my own history in investigating it. I'd like to show you not only the sort of information available from different sources, including in these archives, but sometimes the unbelievable connections encountered when you seriously pursue a topic of interest. It seems to me that an ardent historian tends to become part of the history that they're researching. Who knows that song that we were playing when you came in? Oh, there's the old person here. Sayonara Nakamura was a story of an Okinawan pearl diver who died from the bends when being brought up to the surface too quickly because of an approaching storm off Broome. The singer-songwriter is Ted Egan. Ted Egan is in the Country and Western Hall of Fame as a singer-songwriter. Ted Egan, possibly some of you also know, was the administrator of the Northern Territory for some years, and he's also an historian. And that has he in particular has some connections with my own story. My own journey into history started 11 years ago when I visited Townsville for the Oceania Masters Athletics Championships. I caught up with this old friend, Bob Clayton, who I hadn't seen for about 30 years. He too had studied architecture at Waseda University in Japan, but about 8 years before me. Bob is a keen yachtsman, and after I did my running, we sailed together around Magnetic Island, and then we caught up with the owner of this house in Victoria Street, Stanton Hill. The house was completed around 1890 and from 1896 became the residence of Nakagawa Tsunejiro, the first Japanese appointed as a career consul to Australia, because all the Japanese that were here were in North Queensland at that time, or virtually all of them. The current owners, June and Paul Tonoir, purchased it in 1984 and faithfully restored it to its original condition at the time when it was used as a consulate. It turned out that Paul grew up in Canberra, being the son of the first chief entomologist at CSIRO, a Belgian gentleman. We found a lot of shared interests, and he gave me a copy of this book, Sound of Summer Seas, which is about the early connections of North Queensland and particularly of Townsville and Japan. While flipping through that book in the evening, I found a photograph of this grave of a Japanese sailor buried in Townsville, you see, on the 14th of April 1900. He was from His Imperial Japanese Majesty's ship Hiei, a naval training cruiser touring the South Pacific. What caught my attention was his name. His family name, Kawai, was that of my own Japanese wife, and rather unusual in those characters. Though I've yet to establish any specific relationship, there was, however, an even stranger connection. How many of you know this building? Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion in Kyoto, after being turned an overwhelming gold just before the Nagano Olympics. This is it when I first visited Japan in 1970 at the time of Expo 70. A re-erection after the original, built in around 1395, was burnt down by a novice monk in 1950 and rebuilt a few years later. And here it is in a painting from around 1900, which hangs in my home and came by my mother and reportedly her grandparents, my great-grandparents, received it for entertaining officers of a visiting Japanese naval ship, which seems most likely to have been the Hiei. Anyway, back in Townsville, there was another grave marker, as this is, that Bob had come across on one of his sailing trips and had raised his curiosity. It reads, Nihonjin pearl diver koko ni nemuru. A Japanese pearl diver rests here. It raised his curiosity because that's grammatically correct Japanese, but probably not what you'd expect as you saw before on a gravestone. It's obviously to do with pearling. But it's in a national park, yet it's being looked after. So what the heck is going on? Bob sought my help in discovering what was going on, and that's when I got caught up in all this. It's on Gould Island, that little island off Cardwell, near the end of this beach. It exists somewhere up here. And here is a photograph on the edge of that same beach and of what was the Gill family homestead sometime around 1915. Our first big breakthrough came with this photo from the Cairns Historical Society, and it's taken by its founding president, Ernie Stevens. The only information with it was grave of Tanaka 1930. We weren't sure whether 1930 was the date of the grave or the date of the photo. But anyway, Bob went to the Register of Births, Deaths and Marriage and extracted the list of every Tanaka who had died in Queensland up to 1930. And to our surprise, it had 9 names, despite the White Australia policy. But only one of these names, Tanaka Tokajiro, could have possibly fitted in with what we could read of a seemingly 3-part name, 3 kanji name, on that previous grave marker, though Toka didn't sound quite Japanese. Anyway, a bit reluctantly, Bob forked out the $35 to obtain a certified copy of Tanaka Tokajiro's death certificate, and we found his cause of death was supposed drowning during cyclone on the 10th of March 1918 at sea near Hinchinbrook. We had our man. But more excitingly, there was a magisterial inquiry into his death. And that, of course, led me here. For me, the coronial files held here are probably the most important documentation for my research, because not only do they have first-hand accounts of these incidents where people have died, but sometimes they even have the original signature of the people making the depositions. Of course, there was no signature of Tanaka, but we guess Toka was more probably Taka or Take. And when, a long time later, we got a much better resolution photo, our deduction was confirmed. However, the better resolution photo also drew our attention to two other things. There's a mistake in the kanji, the last kanji, with it reading kurasu, live, rather than haka, grave. And also, the stakes seem very nautical, going from square to round, possibly a little hole near the bottom. It's looked like a small bowsprit or similar of a lugger of the time. This is a Hesperia, a Thursday Island lugger of that period. Thursday or TI as it's typically called. And here is the eastern side of the township of Thursday Island at that time, this part typically known as Japtown or Yokohama. Matching the information in that magisterial inquiry and to another into newspaper records of the time allowed me to establish a fairly detailed picture of what was going on. And there were 5 luggers on the reef, the Great Barrier Reef at that time, when a Category 5 cyclone hit without warning on a Sunday morning. And I learnt that they were probably after this bêche de mer, or known as trepang, or in Japanese namako, and also trochus shell. In pursuing my research, I sought to background myself on trepanging, and the most informative book I found was this, written in 1937, The Adventures of a Trepang Fisher. This was the best I could find for these sorts of things, and the National Library had the original, and there was a reprinted version of this book by a company in Western Australia called Hesperian Press. In researching any topic, as many of you know, it's always a good starting point to pull out the best research in a closely related topic and to start investigating their sources. This book is not a good example of that because it was more for general background, yet it did turn out to be of enormous value because of an unbelievable connection that I didn't at first realise. The author Sunta's boat captain in his trepang fishing adventures around the Northern Territory Cobourg Peninsula was a fellow nicknamed Hana, whose real name, shown here, was Hoshikawa, and who it turned out had been a crewmate of Tanaka when he drowned off Hinchinbrook. As that cyclone bore down, the 3 of the southern luggers, the Tally, the Shamrock, and the Norman, ran for protection in the lee of Gould Island and of the northern edge of Hinchinbrook. I won't go into all the details of those, but 2 of those boats chopped down their masts. The Shamrock didn't, and it sank. It had a crew of 5 Japanese and 8 mainland Aboriginals. 3 of those Japanese I know were from Wakayama, from where many or the majority of the Japanese, as you'll hear more, tended to come. I haven't got further information on the captain and other older member of the crew. Sometime, probably around 9 p.m. on Sunday the 10th of March, when the cyclone was at its worst, the Shamrock, which was sheltering off Gould Island, was swamped by a giant wave, rolled over and sank. 7 of the Aborigines were washed up together on Little Garden Island, about a kilometre off Gould Island. Hoshikawa is said to have swum for about 8 hours, so probably much more, and early in the morning washed up somewhere on Hinchinbrook, and Osada was washed up somewhere in this area called Hecate Point. On the second day after the cyclone, Joseph Samuel Gill, when you saw that farmhouse before, he was a farmer residing on Gould Island. This is Little Garden where the Aboriginals washed up. His farm was in this area, and he heard them as the waves died down, calling about a kilometre away across at Garden Island. He went across in his flatty and brought him back to the beach and his homestead. And here is Farmer Gill with his family sometime not long before the cyclone on that beach. Of the two Japanese who survived the sinking, Osada returned to Japan in 1921, while Hoshikawa, in fact, spent most of the rest of his life in Australia. In a previous talk here in Brisbane, I explained how the first Japanese to arrive in Australia were actually circus entertainers and acrobats, and how one of them, Sakuragawa Rikinosuke, or Dikinoski as he became known, married in Melbourne and tried settling in North Queensland. But I haven't got time, I'm sorry, to go into that in this talk. It's better for us to concentrate on the pearl divers. It was around 1878 that the Japanese became involved in pearl shell fishing around Australia, or at Thursday Island to start with anyway. The very first is believed to have been Nonami Kojiro from Izumo in Shimane Prefecture, a discharged seaman who signed on in Sydney as a pump hand on a Torres Strait pearling lugger, and whose signature we have from a petition of 1891, which is among colonial secretaries' office letters held in these archives. There were relatively few individuals like Nami, but from 1883 a number of small groups were contracted directly from Japan and brought here for the pearl shell fishing industry. And it would appear that many of these early men were from Wakayama Prefecture. Europeans had first become involved in pearl shell collection around 1867 in Western Australia, and a few years later in the Torres Strait when Nonami arrived around 1878, followed by other Japanese and then those contracted directly from Japan in 1883, some of whom went on to Darwin the next year and then subsequently further west. Then from 1892 there was a sudden influx of Japanese men, both to the pearl shell and to the sugarcane industry. The reasons for the dramatic increase in the 1890s are quite fascinating, but one reason dates back to the start of the decade and this famous horse race when the Great Carbine won the 1890 Melbourne Cup. The Tattersall sweep of 22,500 pounds was won by a group of 10 Japanese pearl divers on Thursday Island. And 4 of those were from Wakayama, as far as we know. There may have been more. Ebina Torikichi from Tanami, Nakamura Yasahei from Arida, and Urita Jiemon and Hiramatsu Gorobe from Shionomisaki. When they returned to Japan, that money disappeared pretty quickly. Ebina married one of the most famous geisha in Kyoto and brought her back to Tanami. In fact, Hiramatsu was the only one of the men who didn't spend heavily on women, alcohol and gambling. He invested in cedar-covered mountains of the area and became the most wealthy man in the prefecture. Alas, his son followed in his father's colleagues' footsteps and soon got rid of most of that money too. Men from Wakayama Prefecture, and you see near Tanami, Arida and Shionomisaki, the very southern tip, all in what is now part of Kushimoto, which is the most southern part of the main island. Watanabe, a Japanese government official reporting on the condition throughout northern Australia, observed this in 1893, that at Shionomisaki, for example, almost the whole village went en masse. I mean, already the pearl divers were bringing back, in many cases, great amounts of money, and then on top of that, with them many returning with the absolute fortune from the Melbourne Cup win, there were stories of it raining gold. Hoshikawa was from Tanami, the hometown of Ebina Torakichi. He apparently arrived in Australia firstly in 1914 at Thursday Island, worked for 3 years there. But this photo of him was on his arrival in Darwin from Hong Kong on the 20th of April 1917, under indenture to Captain H.C. Edwards. Within a year, he was back on TI and working for Bowden and May, which seems to have been something to do with the downturn in the pearl shell sales during the Great War. Surprisingly, I have a picture of the Shamrock, the boat that sank. This is from a photographic postcard that a person who became a friend in doing this research just happened to have. I believe I can date this photograph to around 9 a.m. on the morning of the 20th of January 1918, as it was about to depart on its final fateful voyage. The resolution in this photo is so good, I can identify Hoshikawa on the foredeck. From the magisterial inquiry, I know that Hoshikawa, after getting back to TI, was already working on another lugger, Freya, from around May 1918. But after that, he disappeared out of Queensland records. So I went trawling through old newspapers using Trove, the digitised records through the National Library, searching for Japanese, Tanaka, lugger, Norman. Norman was the other boat that didn't sink and actually rescued Hoshikawa. And I got a hit on all of them with this page. This is a photograph from a book called The Caledon Bay Murders, and dealt with those that occurred in 1932 in East Arnhem Land. In the central photo, we have another Tanaka, a Japanese, from a lugger, dead on the beach, and apparently Norman was the name of the magistrate looking into the matter. This is where those men were buried. Tanaka and his four fellow Japanese trepang fishers were killed by the local Yonu, and this photograph of the burial spot and the person who organised the burial was a person named Fred Gray, another trepang fisher who was in the area. The photos are from this book, Justice All Their Own, by Ted Egan, the singer-songwriter of Sayonara Nakamura, written from research over many years, and this is probably the most comprehensive analysis of the incident at Caledon Bay and subsequent events. And here is Ted with Fred Gray, who took those photos. Now here's a photo Ted didn't have, but was one garnered by me through personal contacts developed in pursuing my research. The photo was taken the year before the murders in 1931 and is of the Myrtle Olga, one of the two luggers owned by Louis Keppert, on which Tanaka and his crewmates went trepanging, and Tanaka is presumably one of these three men sitting at the right. And this photo, which you see on the front of my book, is of Kinjo, the Okinawan, who was the sole Japanese survivor of that episode, with 4 Tiwi Islanders who survived with him and travelled on foot about 250 kilometres across the Arnhem Land Peninsula. Kinjo was one of the few Okinawans in Australia at that time, and the photo was taken at the Keppert camp in Darwin when they eventually got back there. How I managed to get this photo is even more surprising than the last. You'll remember that farmer on Gould Island who rescued the Aboriginals was named Joseph Gill. Well, I had a neighbour named Brian Gill. I thought, well, not much chance, but it's worth having an ask. Never missed an opportunity. Sadly, it turned out he was unrelated. He in fact grew up in Essendon in Melbourne, not far from where I grew up. And it turns out his grandfather had been a blacksmith on Mount Alexander Road, whose claim to fame was that he shod the Great Carbine that won the 1890 Melbourne Cup. But more amazingly was that his mother was a Kepit, the niece of the owner of the boats which Kindo Tanaka and the others were on in that trepang fishing adventure. Long before I established that connection, I stumbled across another potential connection. As I said before, when doing any research, go firstly to the research of the great minds that have gone before you. In much of what I have been investigating, this was the late David Sissons of ANU, the preeminent scholar on early Japan-Australia relations. In 1973, and perhaps again in 74, he visited the old cemeteries of Darwin and made notes of what he could read of the inscriptions. I was going through his papers in the National Library and I began to recognise some of the names. Ikuchi and Isosaki were crewmates of Hoshikawa, killed in an incident at Trial Bay, adjacent Caledon Bay, in 1923, 9 years before the one Ted Egan wrote about, but by the same tribe. This incident had been mentioned in Sunta's book, and with another Yuki, as you see there, probably that man's brother, was one of the survivors of that incident with Hoshikawa. The five listed on the right are Tanaka and the other crewmates of Kinjo killed at Caledon Bay. So we have here a grave in Darwin to those killed at Caledon Bay, which was quite a shock because we had the pictures of them being buried at Caledon Bay. I rang Ted Egan to tell him, did he know there was a grave in Darwin of the Caledon Bay people he'd written about? He told me, no way, I must be mad. What they were buried at Caledon Bay. So I started to investigate. And here are the headstones of that first group in the old Palmerston or Pioneers Cemetery, and their inscriptions and translations. And these were the colleagues of Hoshikawa. And that of the second one at Gardens Road, this is to the 5 trepang fishers who were killed, and Ted Egan wrote it about. And here are its descriptions, and including the Tanaka Yasuichi. Having clarified those in detail, I then identified all other Japanese headstones in those 2 cemeteries, and then started on those who died but for whom headstones didn't exist any longer, and eventually all other Japanese who had died in Darwin prior to World War II, and of their stories. One thing led to another, and that led to my first book. Ted Egan came to its launch in Darwin and led the audience in a rendition of Sayonara Nakamura, a modified version I wrote to make it a bit more of a thank you to all who had lost their lives, of whom in Darwin more than 80% were from Wakayama. Ted Egan's original version gained quite some attention in Okinawa and is included as a display at the Oceanic Culture Museum in Motobu, Okinawa. A local researcher there showed considerable interest in that background and contacted Ted. Ted put him on to me, and we started working together. He turned out to be a bit of a disappointment, but it did put my focus back on Okinawans. The song itself is historically accurate. If you'd listened to that music before of about how those things happened, of the bends by somebody being brought up too quickly, where it occurred and that sort of thing. But it's put together with a bit of artistic license in that there were really very few Okinawans around at the time, in Broome, where it's set, and Nakamura is not a very Okinawan name. I've gone through the records of every identifiable grave in Broome. There are only 3 persons named Nakamura, and the 2 with identifiable hometowns were both from Wakayama. In fact, up until 1940, neither in Broome nor Darwin nor TI, among all the graves where their hometown is identifiable, is there a single grave of a person from Okinawa. I think it was Ted's close association with the story of Kinjo that led to the choice of a boy from Okinawa. Yet it's hard to find words that rhyme with Kinjo. The oldest record I have been able to find of an Okinawan in the Australian pearling industry is of this man, Ogusuku Tokumasu, who arrived in February 1917. With the Alien Registration Act of 1916, there was a sudden, much better records of foreign arrivals, yet Okinawans' names like this, Ogusuku, can be read in many ways. Most typically Oshiro in Japanese, but Ogusuku, Usku, Ufugusku. Okinawan is a language in itself. The pearling industry was not the only industry bringing in large numbers of Japanese. By 1896, when the consulate was established in Townsville, on top of about 1,000 in the pearling industry, there were somewhere over 1,000 Japanese working in the North Queensland sugarcane industry. The first had come to the Herbert River area to McNade and Ripple Creek plantations, but they were soon at large plantations like Hambledon, just south of Cairns, and not long after right down to Mackay and as far north as Mosman. They came from all over Japan, particularly from the southern island of Kyushu, but from records here at the QSA, I was able to find one Okinawan, Akamine Rikua, who arrived in 1905. He is identifiable from this application for a certificate of exemption under the Sugar Cultivation Act 1913. This was a Queensland Government Act, so the records are here in the Queensland State Archives. With the First World War, there was a severe downturn in pearling on Thursday Island, but many, like Hoshikawa and the crew of the Shamrock, turned to Trocus and trepang fishing. And that's what sent them south into dangerous latitudes in the cyclone season. Still through such changing opportunities, the Japanese side of Thursday Island, as seen here, continued to grow. And that is where one enclave of Okinawans developed. I know this most particularly from World War II internment records, which shows 16 Okinawans interned from TI. All of them from 2 small islands just off the east side of the mainland, Henza and Miyagi, today joined by a causeway. Some of the details in that previous table come from various registers here at the QSA, particularly pearl divers licenses, through many years, and also seamen in charge, discharge, and operating licence registers. There is also a single pre-war grave of a member of that enclave on Thursday Island, which in itself provides details which can be added to by records in the Register of Births, Deaths, from the Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages, and even more interestingly, as in this case, from the coronial inquest details held here. Sometimes, as in this case, the story is really very sad. But I'll let you read that in the book or in the records here. In many respects, for the Japanese on TI in the decade before the war, things went on as normal. Pearling, picnicking, partnering, though more and more Japanese began to return home and fewer arrived. By 1938, the number of full-blood Japanese males engaged in pearling had fallen to 711, and it halved again over the next 2 years. With the outbreak of war in the Pacific, the situation very quickly changed. In May 1941, the War Cabinet had adopted a strict policy of internment of Japanese should war eventuate, and this was quickly implemented in early December, and all Japanese living in Australia, including in most cases their wives and children, were imprisoned in local makeshift camps and then sent south to large internment camps for the duration of the war. On Thursday Island, barbed wire fencing was quickly erected around that Japanese part of town, and 362 men, women and children were interned there before being shipped south. The majority were loaded into the hold and the small bow cabin areas of this vessel, HMT Zealandia, whose decks were already crowded with evacuees. The Zealandia arrived in Sydney on New Year's Day 1942. Single women and families, including young children, were sent to Tatura in Victoria, while all others, males over 16 years of age, were sent on by train to Hay in the Riverina district of central South New South Wales, where they arrived at this station the next day and were marched into Camp Number 6. Japanese men who were interned from Western Australia were briefly sent to Perth and then on to Loveday in South Australia, where those from the Northern Territory had already been sent. In all, approximately 1,140 Japanese living in Australia were interned. As shown here in Nagata Yuriko's work, the Japanese adult population in Australia in mid-1941 had been just over 1,100. Virtually all who were still here in December that year, along with their children, were interned. However, in addition to local civilians, more than another 3,000 Japanese were interned in Australia from adjacent islands, including the Netherlands East Indies, the New Hebrides and New Caledonia, where New Caledonia alone, where approximately 1,120 were interned. So even from New Caledonia itself, there were more Japanese brought here than were interned throughout the whole of Australia. In contrast to the Pearlers, in most cases, the New Caledonians were men over 50 and about 20% of them were Okinawan. Here are the 18 of the 21 Okinawans who died during internment. And there's some amazing people in there, very trendy. They were all reinterred at what is now the Cowra Japanese War Cemetery in the 1960s. And that's where you'll find them today, though some, like Ebara, caught pneumonia on the trip across and died so soon after their arrival, they haven't even got his name right there. In the next few days, we're marking the 75th anniversary of the breakout at Cowra, which largely led to that Japanese war cemetery, and where men such as these later became reinterred. From 1943, all males who had been involved in seamen in pearling were co-located at Hay and reclassified as prisoners of war maritime, thus losing many of the rights they'd had as interned civilians. Because of the situation in Japan and the lack of vessels, they were still there in 1946, and I believe that man is Hoshikawa, who for some time became the camp leader at Hay. By the way, not a single Okinawan interned from TI died during internment. And in fact, 6 children were born to Okinawans during internment, something I found quite amazing. The men at Hay were repatriated to Japan with many other POWs on the number 1 Daikai Maru departing Sydney on the 2nd of March 1946. In the years after World War II, the Labor government was dead set against the reintroduction of any Japanese, as you'll see here in Caldwell's statement. Let me repeat for the last time that while I remain Minister for Immigration, no Japanese will be permitted to enter this country. They cannot come as the wives of Australian servicemen for permanent or temporary residence, nor as businessmen to buy from or sell to us. They cannot come as pearlers or labourers to pearlers. However, so it was only after the re-election of the Liberal Country Party government under Robert Menzies that attitudes started to change. However, any specific action had to first await the Allied nations' signing of the peace treaty with Japan, which only occurred in San Francisco on the 8th of November 1951, and its subsequent ratification by the Australian Parliament the following March. So with the signing of this treaty came an obligation to enter bilateral negotiations on access to fishery areas, including the Arafura Sea, to which the Japanese were keen to return. The Australian government was so concerned about the implications of such access that in the same week as it ratified the treaty, it introduced this act, the Pearl Fisheries Act of 1952, extending control of fisheries to the 100 fathoms line. A week after introducing that, the Cabinet also agreed to the introduction of 35 Japanese specialists on a trial basis to Broome, and also lifted its general ban on immigration from Japan, permitting the wives of Australian servicemen to enter. The quandary for the Australian side was at the same time as it wished to restrict the operations of the Japanese pearl shell fishing fleet in waters adjacent to Australia, it began to accept that its own use of Japanese divers was the only thing likely to keep its own industry viable. It is this quandary and what happened in respect of it that is one of the main themes of my book. It only took until the 1st of July 1952 for the first serviceman's wife to reach Australia. This photo from the Australian War Memorial Collection is taken in Kure. The British Commonwealth Occupation Forces were based there, led by the Australians. Kure is just near Hiroshima. They say they won the Ashes. And this is where the wives of Australian servicemen were being prepared for the coming culture shock, holding their Women's Day magazines and being shown a map of Australia. And by the way, another strange coincidence, the grandmother of the person here at the archives organising this talk, Alicia Ray, happens to be a war bride who I knew in Canberra 40 years ago, and who I think just may well be in this photo. The first war bride to settle in Queensland came in early 1953. Interestingly, she came to a small sugarcane town in an area where there was once many Japanese. At Babinda, where we have a gentleman in the audience who was born in Shionomisaki, whose grandfather was from Thursday Island, and who later ran a laundry in Babinda, where many Japanese were. The 35 Japanese pearlers, of whom this is about half, only reached Broome in the latter part of March 1953. The Japanese pearl shell fishing fleet finally departed Kushimoto in Wakayama on the 14th of May and reached its designated anchorage off Bathurst Island on the 3rd of June 1953. Both because of the success of the Japanese in Broome and the enormous success of the Japanese fleet just off the Northern Territory coast, the next place to accept the return of Japanese indentured labour was Darwin. And these 56 men flew in there in June and early July 1955. Among the men was Hoshikawa, who came to work for Pasbali. Nick Sr. at the time with son Nick Jr., who's now head of the company. And another of the master pearlers here, Dick Sonners, who sadly passed away last year. I met him in Cardwell, living close by to where the Shamrock sunk almost a century before. I was going up there to mark that 100th anniversary last year and meeting the Japanese Consul General up there, but marking the anniversary of a Category 5 cyclone wasn't a good idea, and neither of us made it because of major flooding in the area. This is Dick Sonners and that crew, together with a few ring-ins who happened to come aboard from one of the Japanese luggers. By this time, mid-1955, however, the Japanese government had taken Australia to the International Court of Justice, challenging its declaration of sovereignty over the whole continental shelf, and it had also introduced a law to potentially control the movement of labour for pearling. The Australian government was desperate to find capable men independent of potential Japanese government control, and so it turned to Ryukyuans. The Ryukyuan Islands are this archipelago centred on Okinawa and extending most of the way to Taiwan. At this time, it was under the control of USCA, the US civil administration of the Ryukyuan Islands. Sorry, I'll go back. The first 24 Ryukyuans arrived in Darwin by a chartered tuna fishing trawler on the 22nd of August 1955 and were sent pretty much straight to work with some degree of rivalry with the mainlanders. Interestingly, the first registered and apparent group leader was Kinjo Anki, and another who returned with him was Yamagawa Sosei. Both Yamagawa and Kinjo were from Motobu and originally arrived in Broome around 1927 and moved to Darwin together, surviving a cyclone then in 1929, and stayed on there for more than 3 years after the massacre at Culloden Bay. Both he and Yamagawa moved to Palau in 1937 to work for the Japanese pearl shell fishing fleet, so they weren't interned during the war. Sometime after their return to Darwin in 1955, Kinjo caught up with Fred Gray, the man who had buried his mates at Culloden Bay. Until after the Labor Party lost government in Queensland in August 1957, no foreign immigrants were allowed to return to the pearling industry of Thursday Island. It wasn't until March 1958 that any arrived, and they were all Okinawan, and they all came on this vessel, the Eastern Queen. 162 at once. They immediately started work on luggers like this, the Sydney, yet within 2 months of the arrival of the Ryukyuans, some of the companies were experiencing cash flow problems. Around the start of May, the Honorary Secretary of the Torres Strait Pearl Shellers Association, Harold Hawkins, passed a letter to the Minister for Primary Industries claiming the scheme was a failure. Hawkins attributed the problems to the fact that the men were not as experienced as hoped and sought that all Ryukyuans be repatriated at Commonwealth expense. When he was called to a conference at the Department of Primary Industries, he apparently chose to withdraw the letter and agreed that the Ryukyuans had not been given a fair chance. But over time, his attitude again hardened. It seems, however, that the most significant factor affecting the profitability was the introduction of new stringent shell grading requirements by Otto Gurdo and Company just at the beginning of that 1955 season. This was based on its assertion of high stocks of unsold shell and falling demand. Gurdo had a virtual monopoly over the sale of all shell, and the effect of the regrading was to make half of the even limited amounts of shell that was collected unsaleable, especially as Godot was unwilling to pay advances on any lesser grade shell. Those companies that were highly geared through expenditure on new boats and the necessary accommodation for the men were inevitably in financial difficulty. Perhaps Hawkins felt that it would not help his cause to criticise the only person who was purchasing his product, so it seems he settled on the performance of the Ryukyuans as a scapegoat for his own dilemma. All of Hawkins' men and about half of all those who came were sent home in October 1958. Many years later, Hawkins made an even more outrageous claim. Then the Okinawans began dying off with the bends, They didn't know anything about staging. They've got to come up so far and stop for a couple of hours and a bit further stop for a couple of hours. They usually came straight to the top and they were dying like flies. So they all went on strike then and all came inshore and refused to go on boats. And how many died? Not nearly enough, about 12 or 14. This, however, was a claim of a very sick old man many years later who already had something of a stroke. But looking at the facts, in all, a total of 6 Ryukyuans died and only just 3 in that first year. Only one of the Ryukyuans who died, Yarachoshun, was working for Hawkins. He had experience in Okinawa with the same sort of hard helmet diving, and he did not die of compression sickness, but drowned after working at more than 30 fathoms in only helmet and corselet. The only diver to have died from coming up quickly to the surface, Gushi Chusei, appears to have done so after apparently throwing off his helmet, possibly due to a lack of air supply at a time when he was being tended by an inexperienced islander who didn't have the qualifications. Only one of the Okinawans, Hirakawa Kyozo, remains on Thursday Island today. According to Hirakawa, the principal reason for the lack of early success in the collection of shell was the lack of knowledge as to the specific location of the productive beds. All the shallow beds have been largely fished out by the islander divers, but the overwhelming majority of them were unwilling to dive deep, and especially not in the so-called Darnley deeps. Each group of 6 Ryukyuans was paired with 6 islanders as part of their contract, who were not only responsible for general crew work, but also for identification of and navigation to the pearl shell beds. However, as they did not have the relevant knowledge of the deep beds, there was an enormous amount of time spent just trying to locate those beds. It was only a few months before the crews started bringing good quantities of shell, but by that time, some of the owners had stopped sending agreed allotments to Okinawans, and the men refused to continue to work. After completing the draft of this book about 2 years ago, I was invited to give a seminar at the University of the Ryukyus in Okinawa. And after that, I headed up to Motobu in an attempt to catch up with a few of the old divers who were still alive. Motobu was the site of Expo 75, the International Ocean Exposition. A feature of the expo was the so-called Aquapolis, or floating city, designed by the renowned Japanese architect Kikutake Kiyonori. From early the year before this, Kikutake had become my guarantor for study in Japan, and from late the year after, he attended my wedding in Tokyo. Today, the foreshore of Motobu is the site of Ocean Expo Park and a variety of attractions, including the famous Chura Umi Aquarium. Also, at the Oceanic Cultural Museum is that display of Sayonara Nakamura, which I happened to stumble across, and where you can call up and listen to many oceanic songs. In meeting some of those old divers, like Arakawa Senshu and their families, I was invited to give a talk. When I was going to limit it to just the post-war period, I was going to limit it to just the post-war period, until I was asked to extend it for the benefit of one local guest. The man turned out to be Yamagawa Soki, the son of Yamagawa Sosei, featured in my pre-war talk. And I was able to give him this photo he had never seen before of his father. His father was apparently famous locally for constructing the first two-storey house in Motobu. He saved well from his trips to Australia, while Kinjo, like so many others of his fellow Japanese pearlers, apparently gambled most of it away. The next day, this man, Shimabukuro, took me to see another of the surviving divers and the youngest. And he was a Nakamura Shunichi, who was just 19 when he arrived in Australia. So this book has been published not only to reveal the largely unknown link between Okinawa and Australia, but to put the record straight in respect of these men. And anyway, my own journey has become so entwined with the history I've been discovering, I don't think I had any choice but to write it. Thank you.